Some extra time this week, and we thought we'd delve into one of rugby's big topics. And we're going to talk specifically about the issue of player safety, player welfare, something that always provokes debate. We have a lot of emotional conversations about whether enough is being done to ensure modern elite players are as safe as they can be. And it's particularly topical at the moment because a lot of studies, and there's been a documentary that many of you will probably have watched it, Steve Thompson, the former England player, World Cup winner, who was diagnosed with early onset dementia at the age of 42. A pretty heart-rending watch. I know you guys have watched it. As I say, I'm sure a lot of you have too. And another study that came out this week with some quite startling results, essentially suggesting that elite rugby players are as many as 15 times more likely to develop certain neurodegenerative diseases like motor neuron disease. We know the case of Ed Slater recently, who's been diagnosed with that and had to retire, and other diseases like early onset dementia and CTE. As discussed, Andrew, it was a pretty sobering and heart-rending watch. It's a difficult question to ask sometimes, but as ex-professionals yourselves who played at elite level when all athletes were bigger and faster and stronger than they were in the 70s, 80s and 90s, is this something that concerns you? Do you worry about what the future holds?
I don't worry about what the future holds for me, because I had one or two, maybe two, I would say, concussions during my playing days. They were dealt with very well. I was looked after, and I've had no symptoms. I finished playing rugby 4 or 5 years ago, and I've had no symptoms. So for me, not concerned at all. I think I'm okay. I'm in good shape. But I'm worried about the sport. I'm worried about where the sport's going. And as you say, it was an emotional watch, that documentary, and it's a frightening one. And there's something going on, and there's some concern massively, and I suppose questions are being asked, and whether rugby has the answers, hopefully it does.
Yeah, it was a brutal watch, Tom. You know, some of the scenes in there where Steve Thompson couldn't remember the names of his children, and it really brought home just how badly affected some of these rugby players can be. And as we know, there's an ongoing lawsuit against some of the game's governing bodies, with quite a few players now on board who've been diagnosed themselves with similar conditions. It seems like a ticking time bomb, this. Do you think enough is currently being done to ensure the safety of players?
They're looking at every aspect of the game, limiting head conditions, looking at the tackle, looking at the breakdown. It can't happen overnight. You know, it has to be an ongoing process. The game can't change just like that. It is worrying, especially when you listen to Steve Thompson and Michael Lippmann, another one. I listened to him on the radio, and it's very, very sad. And, you know, if they could go back in time and not play rugby, they would. And that's a huge statement to have. It's such a massive sport. You know, we don't want to see it die. We don't want to see it finish. But player welfare is the utmost importance. And it's not something we would have talked about 10, 20 years ago. But as it becomes more professional, as players get bigger, as there's less space on the field, there's naturally going to be more collisions, there's naturally going to be more head contacts. So it's a very worrying time, I think, in rugby at the moment. And it's worrying because of participation, and it's worrying for parents. You know, like, we've all got kids, and I'm looking at the game now thinking, do I really want my kids to be part of it? And that's the biggest thing, because if parents stop their kids participating at young ages, then they're not going to get into rugby. So I don't know. It's difficult to say without knowing exactly what World Rugby are doing. They are investing a lot of money into player welfare, but it has to be looked at really, really quickly.
You sense, don't you, this is a pivotal moment, because as Tom says, if this leads to sort of scaremongering and participation levels dropping, then rugby could literally die as a sport, because there won't be another generation coming through. And a lot of these players who have or are participating in this legal action have said, you know, their object isn't to kill the game, it's to save the game. And hopefully this will lead to changes that will make it safer, and awareness will become a much bigger thing. Some of the things that were mentioned, Andrew, in the documentary were, you know, extending the layoff period for those with concussions. It has already changed, isn't it, to a minimum of 12 days now. We've seen that with Gareth Anscombe already this season, taking 12 days off and missing the next game. The other thing that was interesting, and we talked about this a bit off air, was reducing the amount of contact training, because actually most of the concussive injuries happen in training rather than on the pitch. Is that something you've seen come down over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. When I started my career, there was a lot more contact in training than there was at the end of my career. And there was very little at that stage, and that was 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm led to believe there's next to nothing in training now.
So that's a positive step.
Absolutely, and it's probably a reflection, I think, of the point I was going to make, Shanks, was that the culture has changed. You know, what can rugby do to change? I think the culture has changed dramatically. It's unthinkable. It's not unthinkable. It's very, very unlikely that someone gets a knock, an obvious knock, and they stay on, or they would fight to stay on, because guys understand now how serious that is.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a lot has been done. I remember being dragged off. You know, I didn't have a choice. I was taken off. And that's a good thing. I think things have changed quite a bit.
Yeah, you can see players walking to the side now without having any physio or doctor come on and saying, you know, I don't feel right in my head. I need to get it checked. Yeah. And you would never had that. No. You know, 20 years ago, you would do as much as you could yourself to stay on the field because you wanted to. And I think now it's become, I think it's now become definitely a different mindset with players that if they do take a knock to the head, the first thing they want to do is get off. Another thing will be red cards that we're seeing.
Yep.
So we saw Bundyaki get red carded. We saw Fafita get red carded today as well. It's like, you know, when challenging for the ball in the air and players landing awkwardly, that was soon stamped out the game because there were red cards given. Yeah. Similarly for high tackles. Now we start seeing more red cards given at breakdowns. I think it will soon stop players and they'll think twice about trying to wipe someone out in the Jackal position. And that is another aspect we have to look at, the Jackal.
The only thing about the red cards, though, I think we've took a step back a little bit. At one stage, it was zero tolerance. You clip someone in the head, 100% red card, no conversation, basically. And now we're introducing 20-minute red cards. So what message are we sending? This is really serious 1 minute. Actually, it's not that serious the next minute.
The last World Cup, there were red cards galore, weren't there? Because that was when the directive came in on high tackles and it was policed exactly according to the law. But that has definitely dropped off, hasn't it?
There's different instances of red cards. Like the wipeout we saw today, you know, clear red. And players will certainly think twice about that. There's been two, as I mentioned, Bundyaki, but there's different red cards for different issues. You know, it's difficult to get low all the time in a tackle. Sometimes you've got to be upright because you've got to change direction. You change direction because the players change direction and contact is made with the head. You know, that's slightly different to wiping someone out in a ruck from 15 metres. So yeah, it's that fine balance, and it's subjective as well. Like some referees deem it a red card, others don't. We saw it with Cardiff against Glasgow. It was Jordan made a secondary tackle upright to, I think, Josh Adams. We thought it was a red card in the commentary booth, and the referee deemed it a yellow. So it's difficult.
Joint injuries is almost another category altogether, but you've mentioned the Jackal there, Tom. That's been the subject of enormous debate over the last couple of seasons, whether, you know, rucking was banned because that was considered too dangerous, and jackling almost came about as a replacement. You couldn't run over bodies anymore. You had to stick your head in and try and win possession that way. Rory Darge already this season has had a pretty much a season-ending
one of many
injury.
He is.
Yeah,
in that
absolutely.
position.
And it's always ankle injuries or knee injuries because of the position you're in. What are we to do with that, Andrew?
Yeah, the breakdown. I mean, I suppose when you're talking about how, you know, we could potentially lose this game, we're talking about that documentary and how sad it is and how frightening it is. It's also frightening to lose this game that's, you know, shaped our lives, and we love this game. And I wouldn't be the person I am if it wasn't for this game, the opportunities and the people I've met and the environment. There's so many amazing things about rugby, and having the opportunity to experience that. That would also be unbelievably sad not to have the game that we grew up loving. So
Absolutely.
Whether we, the purists out there will say you can't lose the Jackal, you can't lose the scrum, you can't lose a scrum. I wouldn't care about the scrum, to be honest.
You'd happily lose the scrum.
No problem. Lose the scrum, lose the kind of core elements of the game. But if you don't concede, maybe, or at least certainly have a conversation about some of these elements of the game, then potentially you might lose the game altogether.
I think there's ways you can make the Jackal safer for the Jackler, because he's in a position where you can't look up, can you? You can't see what's coming. It's better
not being able to look up.
It is sometimes, but you're bracing yourself. I think we have to look at the roll, you know, because that's where a lot of knees and ankles go when you can't remove someone straight away, so you try and roll them over. Now the neck roll's gone, but I just think rolling in general, trying to roll players in general, because that's where you get some massive, you know, you're talking about maybe 18 months out with knee reconstructions because your knee gets stuck.
Dan Levy, career over.
And also, you know, what we saw today from Fafita. Sometimes you just, if you can't wipe someone out legally, you can't do it. And there has to be I think, a bigger duty for care for the Jackal in that position.
World Rugby has been pretty open-minded in a few areas. I mean, we've seen a lot of experimental law trials. The 50-22 has been a big hit. There's been a few, like, do you remember the captain's challenge?
Not so much of a big hit.
No, there's been a few failures, but at least it shows they're open-minded, they're trying things, and they're trying to take the intensity out of the game or the physicality out of the game, look after the backfield a bit more, and you get the added benefit of having a slightly more entertaining game. But yeah, taking the edge off those collisions, those big physical, direct collisions, and that's kind of a starting point, I suppose.